United we're as strong as a mountain. United
This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek, and we're talking with Ashley Gjøvik, and she was formerly working with the Apple Corporation in Cupertino and had a struggle over health and safety and over protecting herself and other workers, and learned a lot about Apple and about the system. So welcome to Workweek, Ashley.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. I'm happy to be here.
Ashley, why don't you talk about how you arrived at Apple? What was your history?
Yeah, so I actually was working in research and development. I just graduated law school a couple months ago. I worked at Nike and then Apple. I was a release manager and project manager, program manager. My last role is also a chief of staff. So leading really, large, complex projects, a lot of responsibility. Engineering wasn't my passion. I was really good at this stuff and I liked the complex problems, but I was in law school because I wanted to go work on human rights. I was always kind of a socialist growing up, and it was kind of a shock to end up at these giant companies whose values did not always align with mine. But Apple was really good at holding itself out as kind of different than the rest, that it was standing up for human rights and standing up for privacy and all of that. And I never really had the occasion to fact check that in a meaningful way. So I just kind of went along with it until 2021.
So you actually went to law school. You went, I understand, to the University of Santa Clara.
Yeah, they had you could do a part-time evening program. So it was 4 years instead of 3. So I'd work all day at Apple and then I'd go take evening classes at the university at night.
And so you start to work at Apple, and what was your job there?
So when I joined Apple in 2015, I was an iOS release manager. So it was my job to make sure that, when you get a notice on your phone that says time to update your software, everything that went along with preparing that, even like 9 months prior to it actually going to the customer's phone, I was accountable for specific releases. So that was very high stress, as you can imagine. And then I moved to a role where I was accountable for customer field issues that were significant enough to cause a lot of returns or bad social media coverage, making sure we figured out what was wrong and fixed it and deployed a fix to customers. And then my most recent role, I was working in this hardware system quality team where we would, any kind of new product, a new Mac, a new phone, making sure that the system and software was ready for customers when it would ship, and then watching it and make sure it was once it was out the door. And then I was also chief of staff for some of the executives in that org. And
it's an international global operation. How do all the parts work to get something like that working together on a global level?
It's an enormous amount of teams. It's really complex, but Apple was also really secret. So even after everything, I'm like, I don't think I can tell you that, Steve. So Apple, from day one told us, don't even tell people you work for Apple. Don't even put it on LinkedIn. And I don't think that's true maybe for everyone, but at least the research and development teams where we have visibility to the new software, the new hardware, all that. They really put the fear of God in us to not talk about just anything related to our jobs at all, even with significant others and family. So I still have some of that fear. And
like you're working for a secret government agency or something.
Well, and then when they have these secrecy trainings, they would have what they would even disclose were ex-FBI, ex-CIA, ex-NSA operatives in the room, which at the time seemed a bit bizarre. And even now it's much more disturbing that I've seen that they also employ a lot of executives from those agencies as well. So part of me wonders if it's like a government agency or if part of it is to be determined on that. I'm still pulling threads on that whole.
And also there was some news in the Bay Area about some person got an Apple phone, and apparently the police were dispatched to go after this person. It sounded like there was a very close relationship for police forces and Apple.
So it was even worse than that. There's 2 incidents. I think it was 2010 and then 2011. The 2010, I believe, was it was like there was a lost prototype. So some Apple employee, I guess, was drinking at a bar and had a future iPhone that was not announced yet and left it there or lost it. And so Apple was on the hunt trying to find it, which, you can argue that these, security teams, that's probably their only legit prerogative, is to go protect intellectual property. However, so they apparently for some reason thought that this guy had it in San Francisco. He was not an Apple employee, and it's unclear why they thought he had this prototype, but they show up at his apartment and they hold themselves out as active police officers. and asked to search his apartment and ended up threatening deportation. This was a Latino man, and they're like threatening deportation if he doesn't cooperate. And it kind of blew up on the news because that headline got up of like Apple pretends to be police officers searching this guy's apartment. And then it comes out that apparently the San Francisco Police Department was with them, but off the books, which was weird. And then the next year, another prototype went lost, and a Gizmodo reporter somehow got it. It's unclear how he got it. Doesn't sound like he took it or got it in a legal way. But Apple somehow got a search warrant to search his apartment in the middle of the night and took a bunch of his documents. This is a journalist. And EFFF and ACLU protested, and it ended up being found that the search warrant was unlawful. It shouldn't have been issued. And with both of those, it also came out that Apple's on some kind of police and law enforcement advisory board over Silicon Valley in San Francisco. So yeah.
So there's an integration between Apple and police security forces in the government.
Even looking on LinkedIn, Apple's apparently hired a bunch of ex-chiefs of police of Silicon Valley cities, and they're just on advisory roles reporting to Apple, which is curious.
So you were working in Cupertino. Why don't you talk about what happened?
Apple, from day one told us, don't even tell people you work for Apple. Don't even put it on LinkedIn. And I don't think that's true maybe for everyone, but at least the research and development teams where have visibility to the new software, the new hardware, all that. They really put the fear of God in us to not talk about just anything related to our jobs at all, even with significant others and family. And when they have these secrecy trainings, they would have what they would even disclose were ex-FBI, ex-CIA, ex-NSA operatives in the room, which at the time seemed a bit bizarre. And even now it's much more disturbing that I've seen that they also employ a lot of executives from those agencies as well. So part of me wonders if it's like a government agency or if part of it is to be determined on that. I'm still pulling threads on that whole.
So you were working in Cupertino. Why don't you talk about what happened, how you discovered that there were health and safety problems at this facility?
So when I first started, I was at that Cupertino Infinite Loop building where their headquarters had been. And then when I joined that team in 2017, the hardware team, their office was up in Sunnyvale. So Apple has a lot of offices across Silicon Valley outside their headquarters. When I moved in that Sunnyvale office, they didn't tell me anything about it other than, oh, this is your new office. But I actually had a friend who warned me, she had grown up in the area, that this was a toxic waste cleanup site. It was a Superfund site. And she warned me oh, this is pretty contaminated. And I had nothing about it. And at that point, I still just kind of assumed, especially Apple, who acts so good and they care about people, that they wouldn't put us in harm's way. So I kind of just brushed it off. But it bothered me because, I talked to a couple coworkers over the years and they had no idea it was a Superfund site. I was the one that told them, and then we're kind of quiet about it of the fact that Apple never disclosed it to us probably means they don't want us to know. So we're just kind of whispering about it. Silicon Valley is incredibly polluted, as are other areas in this country. And depending on the amount of pollution and how dangerous it is, it may have city oversight, county, state, or federal. The federal program is called the Superfund program, or CERCLA. It was founded essentially by Lois Gibbs with Love Canal in New York. Just areas that are so dangerous, so polluted. You need the federal government to have very formal oversight of how dangerous is this? How are we going to clean this up? When is it safer for human exposure? So Silicon Valley actually has the most Superfund sites in the nation. And it's a reminder that Silicon Valley was actively used for silicon manufacturing for a good amount of time. And before it was Silicon Valley, it was Defense Valley. There was an enormous amount of defense contractors here for decades, also doing industrial work. So there's a lot of pollution in the soil, in the groundwater, a lot of different chemicals. TCE is the most predominant. So Silicon Valley is kind of a mess, just in general, which is also, what I learned, that there's a lot of these sites all over, and it's very disturbing that they're rarely, if ever, disclosed to residents or tenants or employees or anyone.
So you were moved to this site as a result of a job change. You start working there. What happened next?
I did have this weird fainting spell in my office in 2019, the fall of 2019. But I just kind of chalked it up to maybe stress with law school or something and kind of wrote it off. But then in 2020, I had moved into a brand new apartment in Santa Clara, which is a nearby city. And I got so sick immediately. Like within a week, I was in the emergency room, and I'd spend the next like 7 months on disability of just fainting and palpitations and heart issues and blood pressure issues and all this. Like they were screening me for fatal illnesses. I was so sick. And come to find out, the apartment was built on a bunch of hazardous waste. So that was fall of 2020 that I start learning really about the true history of Silicon Valley and all this pollution. And then also the politics, because I'm like, so I was sick for 7 months. They screened me for all this stuff. Would have really helped if you had told me we were on a bunch of industrial chemicals. Like that's very relevant. And they're like, oh no, they never tell anyone that. And talking to all the like public health departments and environmental groups, quickly learned that it's actually quite common for people to get sick. Not as common that it's so debilitating that you're forced to really figure out what's going on. People usually get like more mildly ill or they're slowly killed. And then just the normalcy of it was really startling to me. So I was doing a bunch of advocacy. I ended up publishing an article about it in SF Bayview because I was so disturbed. It was a huge apartment complex, like 2,000 people. I was so worried I wasn't the only one. And I wasn't. I published the article and more people came forward, but the government still didn't do anything. So that's all fresh on my mind when in spring of 2021, I get an email at Apple to my management team and myself saying they want to test. They used a term called vapor intrusion, but what they're asking is they want to test to see if all the pollution under a building, and again, this is one of the worst sites. This is an incredibly toxic site. It's actually called a triple site because there's 3 of these Superfund sites that like merged into one with all the massive pollution. They want to test and see if that pollution under the ground is forcing itself into our indoor air at our desks where we'd be breathing it in. I think the most horrifying thing, so learning, like there's a lot of these sites and this vapor intrusion testing is actually, it's good when they do it because then you know if it's occurring or not, and they're supposed to mitigate if it is occurring, even though I kind of have issues with like, why are you mitigating and not just evacuating this entire region? Like it just seems so dangerous. Like I'm big on like evacuate Treasure Island too. I'm like, why are you even mitigating at this point? Like just do it over. And it's like, we want to test your office for vapor intrusion. And, you know, because I'd been there for a few years and I had never seen that email before, it's clear to me that they hadn't been testing for vapor intrusion before. If they were doing it every year, it might actually be a good thing, as much as I wouldn't want to be on that site to begin with, but that would mean that they're monitoring it. So I'm asking like, so have you not been testing? When was the last time you tested? Why are you testing now? Was there an incident? And I use that email reply as an opportunity to inform the management team that they were on a Superfund site. And most of them didn't know. And I got a bunch of private thank yous. One of our managers who was from LA mentioned like he was just getting away from all the pollution in the LA. And now he's here with this and was not very happy about it. You know, you have a lot of people who they care about this stuff and they know the impact. So I, you know, explain that to that. And then within a week, my manager meets with me and literally tells me not to talk to my coworkers about my safety concerns. Like when he said that, I was like, you can't say that. like, that's just a given, right? And then he didn't like it when I said he can't say that, and he got even more mad. And so I did reach out though to our environmental health and safety team to see if they'd meet with me, because I became kind of, I call it like an armchair expert on these sites of, you know, I got used to reading over all these pages of government documentation and trying to figure out like, what kind of mess is this? Are they actually doing any oversight? Are there risks? And I prepared a bunch of questions for them, which they were shocked and concerned by that I actually knew what I was asking. They even called that out. They're like, no one actually asks us these questions. How do you know about this? And I'm like, I'm concerned that you're concerned that that's an issue. So I'm asking all these questions. And I realized there's like a long history of vapor intrusion. So that means there's these industrial chemicals under the building that were in the indoor air of the office space for a long time. And these chemicals, you know, a lot of different ones and they have different effects, but TCE is the most common. It's a known carcinogen. It causes cancer because it's known to cause fainting. My heart rate dropped dramatically. My blood pressure was super volatile. It's a central nervous system depressant. Like this stuff is really toxic, short-term and long-term. So seeing that it was like known to be in the air. So again, I'm more concerned now of like, and you weren't monitoring this like annually. And it looks like the last test they did was in 2016, right before they moved people in. The building had been vacant until Apple decided to move employees in. So I'm just getting really upset. And Apple immediately starts retaliating too. They open like investigations supposedly on my behalf into my managers, which I tell them, I'm like, that's just going to cause retaliation. And it did. And they keep going. At one point, employee relations gives me a 5-point balancing test if I want to talk about safety at work. And it was like, the things I'd have to share would be complete, accurate, do not cause a panic, do not make an assessment of safety. And if anyone has any follow-up questions, I just send them directly to Apple and I don't answer. And that you have to say you are an email because that's insane. And I had used an example of like, okay, using your 5-point balancing test, can I tell my coworkers it's a super fun site? And employee relations was like, you don't know if that's complete or accurate. And I'm like, it's public information. There's an EPA URL with their office address. And they're like, well, that's not complete because it could cause a panic. And I just realized like, they're going to do everything.
They're just doing damage. They're just doing damage control.
Yeah. They don't want me to tip it off to anyone else, and anyone that knows, they're going to try to make it go away and intimidate people. And that infuriated me because I had personally felt how sick people can get from these chemicals. I had talked to people who also got sick, like the Treasure Island folks, the other people at my apartment, and knowing this is a very, very serious issue. And I was disturbed by Apple's complete indifference to our health. You know, in saying this kind of stuff, what they're saying to us is, we don't care if you live or die. We're prioritizing our convenience and profits. And that just inflamed me.
And you wanted to protect yourself, the other people in the community, and the people that you work with. So they began retaliating against you. And it's illegal to retaliate against workers for making health and safety complaints.
That's what I told them as they were doing it. And then they did it more. So this all started like March 2021. I ended up being suspended in August and fired in September. So,
what did they suspend you for?
They claimed that they were suspending me while they investigated my concerns about their own misconduct. But they told me that I'm not allowed to organize with employees, and that I was planning to go to the office the next day. So this information arose in like early June, and I don't think they knew what they were telling me, but they were like, so FYI, Ashley, we know you're, interested in the office. We found a bunch of cracks in the floor and we're going to have to repair them. So we're going to do that. We'll have a vendor come on site. And I'm like, excuse me, vapor intrusion occurs when there are cracks in the floor. Can you please confirm you are testing the air before you fix the cracks, so we understand which chemicals we are exposed to and at what levels? And in the email, I even say, for cancer monitoring. Apple says, no. They were in like even an email. We're not going to test it. We're only going to test it after we fix the cracks.
And who was telling you this? What department of Apple?
So Apple Environmental Health and Safety, there was a manager who was working with me. He mysteriously ended up quitting / getting fired, I'm not sure, in like July. And then it was this employee relations team, which isn't like HR. It's a separate team, which they even admitted that like you can't reach out to them directly. They just get brought in on issues, which is weird. And then, I started calling them the employee retaliations team, because not just with me, but like a bunch of other people I talked to, as soon as employee relations gets brought in, like they're just going to retaliate and try to make issues go away and protect the executives. And that's exactly what they did. And I pointed out how bizarre it was to essentially have HR being like public relations for environmental health and safety in all these meetings. So like I'd be asking questions, environmental health and safety might answer them. This guy specializes in like Superfunds and toxic waste. And then like employee relations would like interrupt and be like, we're not going to answer that. A few times even she was like, this meeting's over. Like she just canceled meetings.
And they knew that there were toxins and you were on a Superfund site. They were aware of that, weren't they?
They were aware of that, and come to find out, there were a number of safety issues. So there was based on my complaints, there ended up being an EPA inspection in August that found a number of safety issues. But of course, I didn't mention any of that. And I also come to find out, like Apple was just very, very close with the EPA. So the previous head of the EPA, Lisa Jackson, now works for the CEO of Apple. She leads government affairs and lobbying. And I started raising concerns about that too, as they were being just so awful to me, of like, does this have something to do with her? Seems like it might. And
EPA is supposed to be doing oversight of these Superfund sites, aren't they?
Supposedly in a democracy, yes. Yes. So I did a bunch of FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act, and that's what's been revealing to me as they slowly release them. I mean, slowly. Like I have ones that are like 9 months now, still pending with them. But as they're getting released, I'm seeing what really happened. So when I started reporting Apple to the EPA back in like April of last year. Of as soon as they were like, don't talk about your safety concerns, and I saw they hadn't been testing the air, I'm like, are you guys paying attention to this? Also, they're saying really weird stuff. I'd even brought up there's this federal right to know, right? If workers are exposed to industrial chemicals at work, they're supposed to have a federal right to know that. And I was bringing up to Apple, like, how do we not? Well, of course, don't I have a right to know? And they're like, no, you do not have a right to know. Your coworkers do not have a right to know. And I'm like, but if I'm being exposed to hazardous chemicals, and they're like, we have not been testing, so there is no evidence that you have been exposed to chemicals. And then, of course, I'm like, but you're going to test now. And then they decided they're not going to test. And then I started complaining. They all of a sudden decided they weren't going to test when they realized it would probably come back positive, and I'd be asking about it. It sounds like they still haven't tested now, like over a year later. Anyhow, and the EPA is like forcing them to now. So all of that's going on, and it's just a mess. And I had reported them in April, and the EPA apparently turned right around and told Apple I was reporting them to the EPA, and had a meeting with Apple to figure out how the EPA should respond to me.
So they were meeting with the managers, the Apple, to decide how to respond to you.
Yeah, which is extra bizarre because Apple doesn't even own the building. Apple rents. The state of California owns the building. And the responsible party for the contamination, which we'll probably talk more about later, is Northrop Grumman. So Apple's not even party to the CERCLA agreement. But meanwhile, probably because the head of the EPA now is at Apple, the EPA is like white gloving it and working with Apple to figure out how to make me go away, I assume. So the environmental health and safety manager they reached out to no longer works at Apple as of like July. And that EPA person had worked at the EPA for like 20 years. And I had found had interactions with Lisa Jackson, maybe even worked very closely with her for quite some time. And she mysteriously left the EPA last winter after 20 years. So like just every new discovery.
It's the revolving doors from
well,
the
that, or like
industry,
maybe they're just getting rid of people to be like, oh, we fired that one bad one, and they just keep doing more stuff. So they were doing that. And then when I started raising the cracked floor, I think that's when the EPA realized it actually had to do something, because that's literally how vapor intrusion occurs. Under CERCLA, that's a change of circumstances with the building where they're supposed to inform the EPA. There's a change of circumstances. You know, EPA is supposed to have some oversight. And Apple refused to tell the EPA. So I told the EPA. And it sounds like that's when they really started digging in. They also started reaching out to Northrop Grumman and asking for documentation about the site. And in July, they notified Apple they're going to inspect my office. But meanwhile, Apple, is telling me, they've done these stupid investigations, retaliated against me. One of the investigations, they wanted to all be like the complaints about sexism and stuff, which I kept telling them, like, I don't want to complain about this to you because it's just going to cause retaliation. You're not going to do anything. But they kept doing it. And one of them, they like doxed me to one of the senior leaders at Apple, where I had said, like, it was kind of sexually harassing me, but it was like tangential to something else. And they're like, oh, no, we're going to have to investigate that. And I'm like, no, like, you're not going to do anything. It was several years ago. And they're like, we're not only going to investigate it, we're going to tell him you complained. So like, it's hard for me to describe the depravity of how they were retaliating. It was really like messed up because it showed how many different types of retaliation they apparently do to all their employees. So doing stuff like that, my managers are like giving away my projects to other employees. One of them told me I could just quit Apple. They're being awful, all this stuff. But I'm still pushing. And I kind of I realized I was probably going to get fired probably April, if not May. But I was like, if I'm going down for hazardous waste. This is a hill I'll die on. So I keep pushing. They won't test the air until after they fix the cracks. And then I'm worried they're going to cover up how bad the cracks were. And mind you, even during the pandemic, we always had people in the office. There was probably maybe a week in 2020 where we didn't have anyone, but otherwise, because we were a hardware team, we had people there consistently.
And so people are actively in the middle of the pandemic, people were in the office.
Oh yeah, profits over public health, always.
Did you have PPE?
I wasn't in there. It sounds like there was. I don't know how consistent it was. They kind of inferred that any issues with environmental health and safety, including that stuff, was also Apple confidential. So we didn't talk about it much. I actually raised concerns when I learned that when there was someone coming in who tested positive, they were not telling many people about it. They just do people they were immediately next to or something, which I guess sounds not that bad today since we decided the pandemic's over for some reason.
But they didn't
But at
have
the
testing of
time,
everyone, and they didn't inform the people, the workers there.
correct, because then more people would have had to stay home, and then you fall behind on your projects and all that.
They kept the Tesla plant operating in the middle of the pandemic when there was a shelter-in-place order and small businesses had to close, but the
Correct.
Tesla plant was kept open, and Governor Newsom allowed it to stay open, working while the small businesses were being shut down. So I guess Elon Musk has some power over the governor.
Well, same for Tim Cook, right? Apple did this too. It wasn't just our office. We had a lot of other ones that were still open for hardware teams. How they got away with that, it's unclear to me, but they did.
And how many people work in that office building that you're at?
My specific office building, I think it's about 100. Silicon Valley has a lot of Apple employees, though. I think they're up to like 150,000 total or something that they've disclosed themselves globally. But there's tens and tens of thousands of Apple employees. And a lot of these sites are hazardous waste sites. That new Apple Park that they built was on both a state and federal cleanup site. It has a Superfund plume under it too. They, of course, did not disclose that to anyone. My team had another office we'd frequent that was near Apple Park that was also apparently a really bad Superfund site that also had some radioactivity. They also did not disclose to us. So, another reason I fight this is not just my office. Like my office, I had the personal experience to see how they apparently handle these concerns, but there's a lot of these. And I've had other employees reach out to me who had some idea that there were these offices or recently learned. Some of them had mysterious health issues. They have concerns too. But I think everyone's also really scared now to see how Apple handled me with so publicly firing me. That has a chilling effect that who's going to raise health and safety concerns now? So that makes me
intimidation. It's intimidation and terror against employees. You better keep quiet, otherwise you're going to be punished.
Apple, even in their online harassment, came up with a term for that. They've had all these like throwaway accounts that I'm like 99% sure of them. And they were like threatening some other Apple employees, better be careful, you're going to get Gjøvik. So it's stuff like that that's going to make this like a lifelong battle for me. You can't do this.
So you've been Gjøvik. If you complain about your health and safety concerns, you're going to Gjøvik you.
Makes me want to scream for hours.
It's supposed to be illegal to retaliate against employees who raise health and safety concerns. So you went to different agencies about the retaliation. What was your response? Let's talk about the EPA.
I'd raise it them. I'd find out through FOIA that they were actually trying to make it go away. I'd find out they'd have that inspection. So Apple learned about the inspection on July 26th. And I was really concerned about those cracks in the floor. And I saw a notice go out that Apple was planning to do work that first week of August. And I had been up in San Francisco. I was moving back down to Santa Clara. So I had told employee relations at that point, I had already threatened to sue them. And I was talking to the press and stuff. I was telling them like, you need to work with me, not against me on this. We need to do better. And they're still just being awful. And I saw this notice go out that they were going to repair the stuff. And I had told them I was planning to go to my office on August 5th to take pictures of the cracks, amongst other things. I was going to get some evidence too about some of the stuff they were investigating. But then I see a notice that Apple's planning to do work on the site on August 4th. So I'm like, oh, God damn it. So I'm reaching out to some of my coworkers in the building and being like, so I think Apple's going to cover up these cracks in the floor. And I think we, may have been exposed to chemicals through them. If you're on site, can you please help take pictures and gather evidence of what they look like before Apple can fix them? And I had a couple coworkers going around and helping me take pictures, tell me where the locations were, help gather evidence. That was August 2nd and 3rd. And I told Apple Employee Relations I was doing it. Because again, I'm trying to push on them. You can't cover this up. I'm going to make sure this comes to light. Please just do the right thing. It's going to be worse if you keep covering this up. And they suspended me on August 4th and removed me from the workplace and all workplace interactions. So mind you, this is after they find out they're going to be inspected by the EPA at this office. This is after they know that I'm actively gathering evidence before they can cover up the issues before the EPA shows up, and they remove me from all workplace interactions in the workplace. So it looked really bad. And then I find out that they did do an inspection. They found issues. A lot of the issues they found were things that I had raised as well. Technical things like the way that they'll depressurize under the building to try to reduce the likelihood of vapor intrusion. They had it set as passive, and I had encouraged them to consider active, to be more aggressive with the mitigation. They had said no. The EPA said exactly what I said. They had notes of they'll have ports in the floor of the building where they can measure how toxic it is under the floor. And there were a couple of them that the notes had said like they can't find or are compromised. And I was like, you need to figure that out. That sounds dangerous. And they're like, no, it's fine, Ashley, go away. And the EPA said exactly what I said. And maybe the most disturbing thing was the EPA found that when Apple moved in, they moved around a bunch of stuff on the roof of the building. And in doing so, made it so the vents that were taking all the gases from under the building, well, not all of them, but it gave a preferred release so they could go up through this pipe and then vent out on the roof to poison the birds in the sky instead of in the building. But Apple had like lowered them and changed the direction. So the fumes were venting into the HVAC for the building. Go out of your way to be that reckless and dangerous.
It's like the gas chamber.
It's just, I've been told not to use that term. I keep using that term, but I'm like, what else do you call it? Like, it's just, they're bringing poison into our indoor air and shooting at our faces. So yes, I have no words. I have no words.
And I mean, they have engineers, environmental engineers. How can they do that with their ethics, when they know that it's a Superfund site, when they know that it's dangerous, and yet
I assume this came about because of how dumb they are with all of their Apple Confidential nonsense. Like I said, they have a prerogative to protect their intellectual property, but it goes way too far, in my opinion, way too far. Not just in my opinion, according to federal laws to be determined by courts of justice, it goes too far. So
but you're harming your own workers who are making the wealth for you.
But if they did not tell the folks who were making these changes on the roof that it was a Superfund site, if they did not tell them what the different vents were, which is what I assume happened, then they're just going with Apple's, guidance and not asking questions they should. And you'd think like diligence wise, they should be disclosed or push for more information, but Apple's scary to everyone. So a lot of people don't push back, right? So I assume that wasn't an intentional thing. And I will give them the grace of, let's say they didn't know until it was discovered last year. Maybe they did, but I don't have evidence. So let's just say they discovered last year, right? They discover in August of last year when the EPA finds it out and says, hey, that's bad. Even says like those vents are going to pull in the, vent air and tells Apple they need to fix it. And the EPA, as you may know from some of the Treasure Island stuff, they usually don't give orders. They kind of have to actually go to court to give an order. So they generally give, non-binding recommendations and best practices. But those notes from that inspection were some of the closest things I've seen to a you need to do this and fix it now. So they seem very concerned. But then mind you, Apple fires me a few weeks later, even knowing this now, even knowing that I was right about a bunch of the issues I was raising and things were worse than they thought. And if I had not created such a fuss, that they probably would not have figured out about the vents and the roof, right? That only came about because of the EPA inspection, because I raised the issues. They still fired me, which is probably more so they fired me, right? To get me out. And I found Apple actually had the head of the EPA visit them at Apple Park 2 days before that inspection. And I guess Lisa Jackson and Michael Reagan were talking and hanging out. They did a fireside chat and a photo shoot. And I'm just so you were supposedly an independent agency overseeing this company. You were doing this inspection. You're supposed to be impartial. And you have the head of the agency hanging out at the headquarters for 2 days before the investigation. So that was shocking to me. Just they apparently, I assume, just think they're never going to be held accountable. Otherwise, I don't know why they'd press release their own corruption.
Well, they have a great deal of arrogance. That's pretty obvious. And it is because they've never been held accountable, apparently.
And actually sometimes, even 2016, actually, the state of California sued them for $500,000 for mishandling of hazardous waste. And Lisa brought over a bunch of her EPA team, too, to Apple. And her previous press secretary at the EPA did the press release for Apple saying, Apple always goes above the law and this is a mistake. We'll pay our fines, but whatever. And meanwhile, when I was talking to Apple about why don't you do this? Why don't I have a right to know? And Apple's we only do the bare minimum of what's legally required.
I think that's another friend of mine, Becky McLean, who was assigned to Pfizer in Groton, Connecticut. The same thing happened to her. She was the safety unit person and she's a molecular biologist and she went to Pfizer's environmental health and safety department. They told her we only do the law, what the law requires. So it sounds like that's common operating procedure for these companies. Yeah.
And that's kind of what inspired me, though, to start filing a bunch of government complaints to answer your question from a bit ago. So I'm suspended. It's quickly occurring to me that they're just going to fire me, probably in disgrace and be awful, whatever. So I'm like, okay, it's time to, I guess they're not going to work with me. It's time to like report them to all the government agencies for all the stuff they've been doing. So I'd already filed, kind of informal complaints with the EPA. I filed a formal one. And I decided to take it to Twitter. I'm not a big social media person. In fact, had like deleted all my social media a few years prior, but this really seemed like something I was going to have to like advocate grassroots. I'm really glad I did. So I was kind of just live tweeting this whole ordeal since like August. So as I filed these government complaints, I'd like screenshot them and post them on Twitter. And so it actually really helped with the retaliation case, because it's not hard to argue that Apple knew that I was doing this. I'm sure they were watching my Twitter like, as I was also posting all these internal documents and all this stuff about the safety issues and the retaliation. I filed an SEC complaint about not just Lisa Jackson and all of them, if they want to do what's just the bare minimum of what's legally required, sure, but don't make public statements, including your SEC filings, saying you do more than that, because that can be material fraud now with ESG. So I filed an SEC complaint about that. And then also it occurred to me before I was suspended, it was like July, that perhaps Apple was being biased and retaliating so severely because the responsible party for the contamination under my office. So continuing, like today when they say, hey, you need to clean it up, Apple might be CC'd, but they're emailing Northrop Grumman. And Northrop Grumman, if you don't know them, they're like Lockheed Martin. They build bombs and missiles and war stuff. And their long-term CEO and president, his name's Ronald Sugar. He was in charge when they were using my office for research and development in Sunnyvale. He's now the chair of the Finance and Audit Committee at Apple, overseeing things like real estate deals, due diligence, environmental health and safety, legal compliance. So I'm like, you guys, it seems like a conflict of interest. Is this why you're being so awful to me? And then they got really mad when I started bringing him up. So I included him in the SEC complaint. I had also filed a business conduct complaint asking, like, how did you guys mitigate these conflicts of interest with my office? Because Apple decided to rent it in like 2013 while he was on the board. So one would think he would remember his California headquarters when they were doing that. And if he was encouraging Apple to rent it, maybe to because it had been vacant, maybe it's helpful to get people in there or something, or have people in the building who are under the control of Northrop Grumman if there are issues, is probably preferable. There's a lot of potential issues with that. So I filed an SEC complaint. I had filed NLRB charges. It's corporate and all that, but they did tell me I can't talk to coworkers about safety concerns. So that seemed like something that the National Labor
Did they put that in writing, that you couldn't talk to people about safety concerns?
When they would say it, I would document an email. I have a good amount of emails of me being like, can you confirm? Like they stood behind their stupid 5-point balancing test, which, and then what really helped was a FOIA came back showing that Apple tried to get the EPA to sign an NDA before they could inspect my office in August. That it implied that even if the EPA found safety issues, that they would be Apple confidential. And it would have required that the EPA couldn't make any public statements about the inspection or what they find without Apple's permission. And even said the contract itself was confidential.
It's top secret.
Safety issues are top secret. National security, Apple confidential.
Absolutely. Safety issues are top secret.
It sounds like the EPA refused to sign this. So it shows they have some boundaries with Apple. And they were even like complaining to Northrop Grumman about Apple being too over the top. They were saying like when they were on site, they're going to make sure Apple's there. And when they wanted to take pictures of stuff, they were going to point to it and be like, is this, they have like a CBI or something, is the confidential business information, like make sure Apple in person says, oh, that crack, that crack is that CBI. And then Apple's going to have to be like, I guess not. And then they'll take the picture like that. That was in the email chain. So I think that definitely substantiated my allegations and email notes of the verbal conversations they're doing.
And what about Cal OSHA? I mean, it's supposed to protect employees in California. Did you have any experience with them?
Yeah. So one of the tricky things with these Superfund sites is federal preemption. So supposedly there's supposed to be concurrent jurisdiction, because you can have the federal government overseeing the Superfund site, but it's going to be limited to the specific chemicals and the contamination under the building. And OSHA should still have jurisdiction over other health and safety issues. in the building, right? They're not pushed out completely. So I don't know if it was confusion or corruption or what. I had tried to call OSHA because I was concerned about the COVID stuff too. Apple was trying to make everyone return to office, right, with the Delta surge. And I was raising a lot of concerns about that too. It didn't make any sense. And the testing they did in 2016 on the Superfund site also came back with high levels of two chemicals that were not part of the Superfund site. They might have been new ones because there were other chemical plumes that were now pouring into the one under my office. Apparently, it's like getting more polluted, and it included those chemicals. And when I raised it, they were like, no, that's not part of the, they don't want to expand what they're accountable for. So I'm like, if this isn't part of the Superfund though, there's toxic chemicals known to be in the office at high levels, and I fainted, and you're saying I didn't faint because of the Superfund, so could it have been these chemicals? And they're like, no. So Apple's like shutting that down too. So I tried to call OSHA and report those chemicals and concerns, and just the general don't talk about your safety concerns. And OSHA just kept she was yelling at me like, this is a federal matter. They have oversight because it's a Superfund. And I'm like, well, there's other stuff that you have jurisdiction over. And she ended up hanging up on me. And perhaps the most insane part of that was when I told the California Department of Labor later, because I'd filed charges with them as well, their retaliation unit. They were not surprised I got hung up on by OSHA. They laughed.
So that seems to be common operating procedure with OSHA.
Is it?
This was under Doug Parker, who was the former head of OSHA, who now has been appointed by Biden to be head of OSHA, federal OSHA.
Oh. So he's in charge of the agency actively retaliating against me from the federal government.
Yeah, well, he was in charge. He was in charge of OSHA when you were making the complaints and you were hung up on. And now he's in charge of federal OSHA. I guess he's continuing the good job he's been doing.
Wonderful. Good job.
You get a promotion for doing good work at OSHA.
So frustrating. It's so frustrating. Well, and I could see some confusion with the preemption stuff, but it shouldn't be for Silicon Valley. This was I think it was the Fremont office or something. I can't remember, but it was one of those Silicon Valley area ones where there's enough of these sites, they should understand their own laws. So I was not pleased. But apparently me attempting to file a complaint should have been enough for the OSHA whistleblower retaliation. So that's part of my charges, although they're still trying to make sure that nothing actually goes through. So yeah, I filed a lot of complaints at state and federal level.
Did you contact federal OSHA?
Yeah. So even before I was fired, when I was just suspended, I had filed a U.S. Department of Labor OSHA complaint for whistleblower retaliation, and they had docketed it as a federal OSHA case. And then they would later add on CERCLA and SOX as well for the SEC complaints, and then of course the Superfund matters. So I have the federal OSHA whistleblower case docketed.
And did they do an investigation?
So this goes to the real fun part today. It was very bizarre from the beginning. So I reach out to them, tell them what's going on. I do the intake with her. She says the case is docketed, and I'm fired the next day. Meanwhile, again, I'm tweeting this. It's public information. Apple knows I'm, talking to the federal government. They still fire me. And when I get fired, she says something like they're dual filing it and they're asking the state to investigate. And I was like, okay. I'd called the state because I was talking to California Department of Labor, which also they have issues. They only have 3 labor commissioners to investigate retaliation for the entire state of California, which was concerning for a lot of reasons.
Only 3 labor commissioners to investigate these kind of complaints for 18 million workers in California.
Which sounds like one of the most California things I've ever heard now that I've actually learned what California is like. But yes.
And they're less than 200 OSHA inspectors in California for 18 million workers. Even in the middle of the pandemic, they didn't have any mass hiring to protect workers in California. So I guess the priority for protecting workers in California by Governor Newsom and former Governor Brown is very low priority if they only have less inspectors in the state of Washington and other states in California.
Knowing California that, kind of follows with their hypocrisy, where they want to be able to say that they're doing the right thing, but if you actually check the facts, they're clearly not. So they can say they have this department and they can say they have all these laws, but if you actually look into seeing if they're enforced or investigated, they're not, right? So they have their beautiful marketing with nothing behind it. And then it's pro-business behind it.
So you had actually filed a complaint with federal OSHA, and then you were fired after you filed the complaint?
Yeah. And all these, so NLRB, federal OSHA, the State Department of Labor, the SEC, all of this. And I'm a lawyer, all this stuff, you don't have to be right, but you have to be a reasonable guess that laws are being violated. And all of these are, pretty reasonable of the raise concerns about safety, told not to talk about it, suspended, Like, it doesn't sound great, right? So and Apple knew I had all these open government complaints, and then they fire me still with like no explanation of why they're even firing me either, which at the moment everyone's like, why would they think they could get away with it? And now I know, because they basically own these government agencies. And they fired me the day before I was supposed to take my affidavit with the NLRB, my first affidavit, and they knew. They had a workplace violence interrogator reach out to me with this email with no subject line, just demanding to get on the phone with me. And like his subject line said, workplace violence and threat assessment. And I was live tweeting this too, of course. And I was like, does that mean he investigates workplace violence, or he's going to do it to me? Like, what is this? What is this? And I told him, I was like, so happy to meet with you, happy to talk to you. I responded in like 2 minutes. I assume this was just intimidation, but I wanted to comply in case it was somehow real. Happy to talk to you. Just want to keep it in writing, though, as I've been asking for a month to keep everything in writing. And I just want to say this feels a bit like federal witness intimidation the day before my NLRB affidavit. So I just forwarded your emails to the investigator so he knows. And then the guy responds in like 20 minutes saying, because you refuse to participate, we're suspending all your account access. And then I was fired like a few hours later. Really don't care. They have no fear. Like, it was crazy. And that was the week after Labor Day weekend.
It sounds like a complete corporate capture of government agencies, which are supposed to do regulation and oversight of these companies.
Well, that's what I found in the NLRB with the federal OSHA. NLRB, they were acting really bizarre. They weren't letting me provide evidence. They were intimidating me. He was messing with my affidavit. It was very, very bizarre. And then I found out that like there's only 2 investigators for like all of Northern California and Nevada, which is also bizarre. And the other investigator was actively applying to join Apple while he was investigating. And there was apparently at least like 2 or 3 recusals up their supervisor chain of also Apple conflicts of interest. And I had been demanding, like, can I get my case transferred? They kept saying no forever. I finally got it transferred, but it was just very bizarre behavior from them. And then US Department of Labor, I had that case docketed. They said it was dual filed. I called the California Department of Labor to ask, like, why are you investigating federal statutes? And they kind of like act annoyed of like, you know, federal said they don't have enough manpower, so they're going to have them investigate. And I was like, this doesn't really make any sense. They're like, yeah, whatever. But then I like realized a couple weeks later that it wasn't clear if I actually had like the Superfund whistleblower included or SOX. So I reached out to the federal investigator again, and she had made it sound like, you know, the federal case was still open. They were just having state investigate because there was the open state case too. And when I reached out and asked about adding CERCLA and SOX to the whistleblower cases, she then said that she was like dismissing all of my cases, like all of them, and then claimed it was like never dual filed and that I'm not a whistleblower. And when I asked about the Superfund stuff, she said, because Apple told you that everything was fine and you kept pushing, that's not protected. And I was like, have you been talking to Apple even before you supposedly investigate and you're just repeating what they said to you? I didn't say that yet. I was still trying to be kind of nice, but I was like pushing. I was like, what is going on? And I ended up escalating. I did FOIAs and pushed on the solicitor. And they ended up responding after my FOIAs, which showed that they had not dismissed my case until I asked to add CERCLA and SOX, that they actually fully docketed it and added the charges I wanted. So that was like a weird, like, what is going on with US Department of Labor? But they then said they were supposedly investigating. And I got a position statement from Apple, and I had provided a bunch of evidence, and she was supposedly going through it, but it was taking forever. Their statutes say they're supposed to take between 30 and 90 days. And I was not given any of the evidence Apple was supposedly providing about me. And she had told me anything I provided her about Apple, she was going to have to give to Apple. And I had asked some other questions she was not answering. I started getting worried again. And I was pushing, like, what's going on? What's the update? What's happening? Felt like she was blowing me off again. And just recently I pushed, I was like, I want to speak to a supervisor and try to figure out what's going on and kind of like, you know, lodge a formal complaint about the lack of transparency and the delays. And that's how last Friday I found myself on the phone call with 2 supervisors from Region 9, which is the California region, where they essentially just intimidated me to withdraw my charges.
Who are these supervisors?
So one of them was just like the manager of my investigator. And then the other one was the assistant administrator for the entire region. This guy reports to Wolf, who sounds like he was an issue with the previous US Department of Labor whistleblower. This guy is a captain too, which was weird. He's like a naval captain, which is like intimidating, right? You get an unrepresented client, just an employee on the phone with two supervisors. It was really intimidating. And this was the first conversation I had with them. They kicked off saying, first, shouting, "Don't record this." And I didn't even ask to record. So I was like, this isn't going to go well. And then, I had sent an agenda before of a lot of my concerns of why am I not seeing the evidence provided against me? And he's like, we're not going to answer any of your concerns. And it sounds like you're not, you're worried about not getting due process, but that's not an issue. And it says that he read through all the stuff in my case file, which is a lot of documents because this is all really complex because Apple did so much crazy stuff, and says, he's like, so I think we're almost done. And then says that I'm going to get a letter with my appeal options in 6 weeks. And I stopped him. I'm like, per your own policies, I'd only be getting a letter from you if you're fighting against me. And I only care about my appeal options if you're fighting against me. So you just told me you're arbitrarily fighting against me in 6 weeks, and you're not going to provide any of the information used against me to come to that determination. He wouldn't deny it. I kept pushing on him. He got really hostile. We have this phone call, and they're essentially just telling me they're going to dismiss my case without fully investigating if they even are to begin with. And in 6 weeks, and I point out, so he wraps up to saying well, I feel like I've addressed all your concerns. And I'm like, you've addressed none of my concerns. I have so many more concerns. And it sounds like the whole point of this phone call was just to intimidate me to withdraw my charges. And you can hear a pin drop. I don't know if they actually get that kind of pushback that often. I was furious. I mean, I guess luckily at this point, I'd seen so much corruption that I wasn't shocked to the point that I couldn't fight back, right? I was just like, oh God, they're doing this again. And I told them I was going to document the meeting notes of everything they just said to me, and I was going to email it to them. This is what I was doing with Apple, right? If you want to argue you didn't say this stuff, you could argue it in email, you guys. And they're so quiet.
It sounds like a federal crime. They're trying to intimidate a witness to drop her charges against a company.
It feels like a federal crime. That was NLRB 2, where he was altering my testimony in the affidavit with stuff I didn't say during that time. And then when I asked him to correct it, he said it would be used against me if we edit it now. And I'm looking back, I'm like, how is that just not straight up illegal? But then it goes to who's actually going to enforce.
Monty Walsh, the Secretary of Labor, who's supposed to be a big labor guy, have you contacted him about what seems to be possibly criminal malfeasance by his managers of his department in Region 9? I mean, there are other problems with Daryl Whitman at the same division.
I could not find any way to actually reach out to them. Maybe they go out of their way to do this. I did find an email somewhere for Solicitor Nanda, and I had been CCing her on those meeting notes and trying to email her asking for help, but she's never responded. I filed an OIG complaint, but I was really disheartened by the IG complaint based on Dr. Whitman's disclosures, where Office's special counsel had essentially said, we believe all of this. This sounds really bad. Please look into it. And the Office of Inspector General came back and essentially just said, we couldn't find any corroboration for these 120 things, and we're just going to assume everything's above board. Reading that report was really disheartening that even their Inspector General office seems to be covering up for them. So I'm continuing to document it and file those reports. If anyone has Marty Walsh's email, I'd really appreciate it. Well, and as I told them and continue to, I'm not going to withdraw my charges. And I see why they'd want that, right? There's no paper trail of them making decisions without due process or arbitrary decisions if I just withdraw to save face. And I wonder how often that works, right? A lot of people might get worried that if they have a decision against them, it's going to look like they weren't right, that they were wrong, they were unreasonable, whatever it was. And that, in a way, is also, I would argue, maybe defamation of character, that the government is trying to make people look like they were being unreasonable, which would hurt their future career chances as well. So again, just really trying to intimidate, and that's the cover up, right? Easier if people just quit on their own, walk away. And I told them, I'm not going to do that. You can go ahead and find against me, but I'm going to keep appealing as much as I can. I'm going to be really noisy about all of this. And I looked, there was actually a EPA whistleblower under Lisa Jackson who was fired while Lisa Jackson was administrator. And she had a U.S. Department of Labor case. She also went through the merit board. And it sounds like the merit board retaliated against her too. And when she appealed, though, the judge found EPA was destroying evidence, was doing fraud in the court. The judge should have never decided the way she should. So I wonder how many of these cases people are intimidated to just withdraw their claims and we never see light of day, or there's some really crappy initial decision and people just give up. But to me, it's really important to see it all the way through, because I do believe that at the very least, once you get to the highest court, it's going to be really hard for them to keep covering up the fact that they did something really wrong. These judges have to look at what information was reviewed, were the actual procedures followed, what was the basis of these decisions. And if they're completely arbitrary and retaliatory, I can't imagine they would survive several levels of appeal. So I look forward to finding out if necessary.
And of course, the law in California is you cannot be fired and retaliated against for making health and safety complaints. What is the labor commissioner doing about that, or the state of California?
So this was so frustrating too. They had told me it could take a year for me to even get an investigator assigned. And I was telling, because there's only like 3, right? And I was telling them, like, this is like an open, active health and safety issue. And come to find out it is. They still haven't fixed the vents on the roof. They still haven't done the indoor air testing. There's good reason to think that my coworkers are being actively exposed to these industrial chemicals that are known to cause cancer. But so it was like, they have an enforcement team, they wouldn't involve. So they weren't acting. And then when the federal EPA finally docketed the case, they told California to pause California's investigation while they were doing their own investigation. And I pushed back a lot on that because it didn't make sense to me, because California was investigating completely different laws. Like, I filed under California as a Prop 65 whistleblower. There's an anti-retaliation provision for Prop 65. And I had brought up frequently in an email that we should have a right to know, at least under Prop 65, that we're being exposed to this stuff. And then they fired me. So like, that's not federal overlap. I had also argued that a lot of Apple's employee policies are unlawful under California's laws that say you can't have employee policies that even imply you can't report crimes to the government or talk about safety concerns. So again, like, no federal overlap, but federal OSHA said that, like, California, stop everything you're doing. We're going to take over. Well, they apparently don't even investigate themselves and just plan to throw my case. So then I assume federal OSHA says, hey, California Department of Labor, Ashley's charges have no merit. So, go ahead if you want, but maybe you just dismiss her California case too without you even investigating. And then I assume they'll probably do that. And then I'll fight that too. Now I realize, right? The whole thing is stacked against me. It's all in favor of Apple and these politicians and everyone. And this is why they must have been acting the way they did. They really expected to never be held accountable. And I'm already seeing that play out in real time.
And this is Gavin Newsom, his Department of Labor in California, and he wants to run for president. He's a great fighter for the people, Governor Newsom.
A really great example. And Jorts the cat, our labor leader today, Jorts the cat, I love that cat, has been pointing this out frequently, which I greatly appreciate, is Governor Newsom loves to make these statements about pro-labor, but he absolutely refuses to sign bills for labor protections for farm workers. And I'm sure completely coincidentally, he also owns his own vineyard. He profits off of unfair labor practices of farm workers and refuses to sign a bill that would give farm workers labor protection.
It sounds like a double standard, and he's protecting his profit interests. Of course, he worked for Getty, actually, family in San Francisco. He was kind of a gopher for them, and they funded his businesses. And he actually, when he was mayor of San Francisco, retaliated against bus drivers who were mostly Black, who refused a concession contract. He hired a consulting company to try to get them fired. He went on the cable cars. He was very angry that they rejected a concession contract 3 times.
I didn't know that. That's terrible.
Yeah, no, he's a racist and a union buster. So I guess he's carrying on that tradition of attacking you and the workers at Apple who want some protection from a Superfund site, which Apple has an office on.
Well, and it's owned by the state of California too, right? It's the Teachers Retirement Fund.
The Teachers Retirement Fund. And what does the Teachers Retirement Fund say about their investment in this property?
I had tried to reach out to them naively early on, thinking that they might not know what's going on. They might be shocked to hear and want to, help. And I found like contact information on their website and reached out to their general counsel on LinkedIn. 0 response. Absolutely nothing. And I found that kind of surprising. And then now I'm like, oh, they're all in it together.
and their teachers are CTA teachers in California who are on the CalSTRS board of directors. They should take some concern about CalSTRS investment in property and the fact that workers are being sickened by a property that is on a Superfund site, and they are managing that property. They own that property. Also,
California teachers should be aware of this because this is the retirement fund, right? If they are perpetrating corruption and fraud and federal crimes as part of this, doesn't that put the teachers' retirement fund at risk? these teachers who have spent their lives just trying to educate people and do stuff for the common good, and this is the retirement fund, and this is the kind of activities that are being conducted related to that financial fund?
I think California teachers should start writing to the CalSTRS and demanding some answers and an investigation of where their investments are. I mean, it seems appropriate.
I think it does. And I am very concerned now looking at the timeline of CalSTRS taking over that building. It was in 2017. It sounds like after Northrop was made aware that the contamination under the office was increasing from the southern sites, right? So the site's getting worse. And then if they find a party willing to, they had to disclose that to the party, I assume. And then they take it over. Like, is this a friendly crowd that's going to help them cover this up or what? Like, I'd like some answers on that, of the diligence, not just of Apple deciding to rent in 2016 and Ronald Sugar's involvement in that, but also the conversations about deciding to transfer ownership to CalSTRS in 2017.
And it seems like there's a pattern here, because the San Francisco Bayview, which you have written for and is probably the most foremost publication in, at least in California, but maybe even the United States, exposing the systemic corruption of environmental sites that are damaging people, Superfund sites like Treasure Island and Hunters Point. It seems like in your case, you've discovered that Silicon Valley has the same problems as far as highly toxic sites that are being developed for profit by developers and covered up by companies who use these sites.
Indeed. It's really concerning too, because like my office isn't the only one. There's so many of these. They're all over. And the triple site under my office also, the EPA actually sued some of these companies in 2019 because they became aware that the contamination was causing vapor intrusion in nearby homes, schools, churches, businesses. And they had to do this massive vapor intrusion testing and found a lot of it and had to do mitigations. The groundwater where this contamination is under my office, it goes deep, it goes quite deep. And there's an aquifer not too far away that's about half the drinking water for entire Silicon Valley, which is noted as like the risk in these documents. The risks of this are enormous for negligent oversight at the very least, let alone reckless cover-ups. So that's concerning. And then just the health issues that can come from this chemical exposure and how difficult it is to understand how many health issues are related to it because no one's telling people that they're being exposed to these chemicals on these sites. You look at, there's a recent California Department of Health study that showed that breast cancer is about 20% higher in Silicon Valley and areas of San Francisco than the rest of California. And they didn't have an explanation why. How many of these studies are out there that you can be like, well, I can guess why. Like, we should be doing studies, health monitoring to link this stuff because at least partially attributable. And these are, people's lives, either major medical issues or even dying from this stuff. It's very serious. And even the lighter quote unquote of like asthma, breathing issues, rashes, autoimmune issues, these are still things that like can cause the need for doctors and medications and change in lifestyle. Like, these can be life altering. It just seems so unethical to me that they would have so many people on such contaminated, polluted land and not even tell them about it. It's one thing for it, maybe, this is only housing available and maybe it's cost of living. It's still an issue, but like to not even tell people that they're being exposed to this stuff, to me, just feels criminal.
But it sounds like business as usual under capitalism. Both the Democrats and the Republican Party, they're ready to put people in danger for making more profits or even covering up the dangers that people are in.
Exactly. Well, when we see the pattern, when I have to explain Superfunds to people, I like to tell the story of Lois Gibbs. She's a hero of mine. And I think her story of Love Canal tells you everything you need to know about the Superfund program. She was a mom in New York and their town was super polluted. People were getting really sick. There was a lot of cancer. They were trying to ask the government to help and the government wasn't helping. There was big corporations that did this pollution and the government wanted to keep the corporations happy. So they ended up doing protests and a lot of activism. And it didn't come to a head until Lois Gibbs kidnapped 2 federal employees and held them hostage in her house. She was a very nice mom, though. She made them sandwiches. She hung out with them. It wasn't like violent or armed, but like it came to that. And she ended up getting like a presidential medal of honor or something. She got an award from a president for her heroic acts with Love Canal that they finally admitted were needed because it was a public health disaster. And it directly led to the creation of the Superfund program. So situations like Love Canal should never have to happen again. And so when people ask, like, why is it so hard to get the government to actually act and do its job? Why it's so hard to get these companies not to act so recklessly? And I'm like, let me tell you about a woman named Lois Gibbs holding 2 federal employees hostage in the 1970s. Because I don't think much has changed, right? Like, we still have these power struggles. We still have to get really creative and grassroots when we want to try to influence some change around this stuff. And it shouldn't be that way. To me, also working in engineering, it seems like if you'd actually tell people what's going on and engage scientists, academics, community, you could get creative brainstorming on better ways to mitigate this stuff, to address health issues, to make it less terrible. But like siloing the information and keeping it from people is just dangerous in like every way possible.
But it seems like Apple, despite its corporate PR, is actually an obstacle, the management of obstacle of really defending the workers who work for Apple and the community when they continue to fight you and take retaliatory action against you. You wanted to get them to do the right thing.
And that's what I told them from the beginning, like when they were doing this. And, you know, I had a role where I was working with executives a lot and complex high-risk projects. So I was used to being able to, you know, sit at the table with them and have to kind of give hard truths and be like, what are we going to do here? What's the right thing to do to navigate? Not with this kind of issue normally. But I tried doing that with them on this of, you're saying all this, but here's what's actually happening. Here's where I stand. Like, we need to do the right thing. Like, I want to work with you to make that happen. And they just completely rejected it. And I think that, you know, them bringing in their essential goon squad to deal with me instead of even the normal people was also telling. Having the woman that was just like ending all the meetings and saying, we're not going to answer any more of your safety questions. It was very frustrating, but that's still where I am. Like, and you can't, I think it would be an illusion to think you could force companies to do anything anyways. Like, you need to through carrots and sticks, get them to want to do whatever it is. So we still have to work with them. I think there is room for protests or boycotts, or I wish the press were a lot more critical about this. The press seemed very scared, but like naming and shaming, but then also try to incentivize for them too, of like, you know, it's better when you work with us. But I know how naive that sounds now.
And of course, Apple workers are organizing some Apple stores. There's a struggle. And at Google, there's Alphabet Workers Union. It seems that tech workers are beginning to realize that they have to become organizers and they have to become collective if they're going to have real power in the companies they work for.
Indeed. And I'm really excited to see the corporate offices also partnering with the retail offices, and Amazon, you have corporate in the warehouses, and we all have each other's backs in these companies too, if we can work together, Amazon and Apple and Google and all, you know, we're changing the power dynamic. And I think that's exactly why Apple told me not to talk to my coworkers about my safety concerns, right? It's the opposite of when we actually organize and work together, we actually have power and we can drive change. And that's why they try to isolate us and alienate us and ostracize us, because we have much less power. So I think there's a lot of people who are just kind of drawing the line now of, you know, your behavior, whether it's, you know, Google's doing this stuff with Project Nimbus, or, you know, Apple organizing some of these retail stores have also mentioned a significant amount of health and safety issues too, which sound very long running. And it seems like it really came to a head with COVID as well, being forced back into these stores with existing laissez-faire health and safety oversight and retaliation for managers, just like drawing the line of like, it's clear now you're putting profit over lives, and we're not okay with that. And we're going to take a stand. So I think that's incredibly encouraging. And I think for this Superfund, the pollution in Silicon Valley, I think there's also a reason they didn't want me sharing the information I was learning. Is it's very empowering to understand how this stuff works. I highly encourage, especially people living in Silicon Valley, working in Silicon Valley, to learn more about all of this. Learn about Superfunds, brownfields, these cleanups, learn about TCE, learn about land use, learn about vapor intrusion. This is stuff that, whether you know it or not, probably impacts you every day. You know, the chemicals under the ground you might be walking on in a park, you could be breathing in. Like, they're everywhere. And there are maps in California at state level for water boards and Department of Toxic Substances Control, and then federal EPA. They can show you where some of this known contamination is. And I've helped people look it up, and they'll find it at their work or home or another place they had lived. And oftentimes they then start connecting it to medical issues they had, otherwise unexplained medical issues, onset of asthma or something. So I think the more you can learn about it, share it with other people. When people around there are experiencing health issues, bring this up as a potential thing to screen for. I think there's a lot of power and knowledge on this specific topic.
And you have a website.
I have Gjøvik.co, you can come find me at. I also have this website, what'sintheair.org, where I put together resources. People can learn about the vapor intrusion and TCE, health issues from this type of contamination. I have news articles from Silicon Valley and San Francisco area. San Francisco also has a lot of radiation, as we previously discussed, but also Lawrence Livermore Labs and areas peninsula. So there's a lot of stuff to learn and start pulling threads on. Also very highly recommend the San Francisco Bayview newspaper. I was trying to get my story out about what happened to those apartments. They were the only ones brave enough to let me publish it. In fact, they encouraged it because they've been watching what's happening with Treasure Island and Hunters Point and really want to get the news out on this topic because it's so often censored by the press. So support San Francisco Bayview, check out their other articles, learn about Treasure Island, and just start talking about it with people. You know, this stuff is so crazy on face value that it's a good conversation topic. Like if you're having coffee with someone, it could be a whole thing you talk about of just explaining that this is like plan of record in San Francisco and Silicon Valley and how crazy that is.
And the history, the real history of Silicon Valley, I think you're contributing to that history actually by your struggle to protect your own health and safety and those of others, what the reality is and what the connections are.
And part of that, I think, is unearthing the history because it became clear that they put a lot of effort into trying to disappear it. Getting old records from newspapers in the 80s and 90s was incredibly illuminating that there's been major health issues in this area from these chemicals. IBM Fairchild was a huge controversy in the 70s and 80s. They contaminated a bunch of drinking water in San Jose. It caused birth defects, miscarriages, health issues, cancers. And then somehow those stories just disappear. Somehow, magically, right? So I think it's also really important for us to kind of unearth that true history, the people's history of Silicon Valley, and tell those stories because it still impacts us today. And I think it really takes the wind out of the sails of these companies acting like it's a one-off issue today when you can point to, you know, this being an issue for 50 years.
And of course, when Silicon, the industry was being developed in San Jose, Santa Clara County, the peninsula, people were told at that time, this is the clean industry. You have nothing to worry about. It's going to be clean. It's not going to be like those auto plants. So don't worry, be happy. And the reality is not quite the same.
Well, and I mean, that's an interesting, it kind of speaks to Silicon Valley's marketing even today, where they claimed it was clean, but they knew all the chemicals were inside and under the ground, right? They were lying from the beginning. It's just you can't see the smokestacks like you used to, but meanwhile, they have these huge chemical compounds of super volatile, corrosive chemicals in their back parking lot, right? Like they knew from the beginning it wasn't clean, but they decided it'd be fun to market it that it is.
It was a corporate marketing agenda.
It was. So I think it's also just really important to be more critical of these companies generally. And it's big tech, but a reminder too, this is DOD, this is Department of Defense, it's these defense contractors. A lot of them are still the ones responsible for cleaning this stuff up, whether it's Lockheed or Northrop or Honeywell or whoever, and just be way more critical of the connections these companies have with each other and what they're saying. Oftentimes the truth is just right out there and they'll just be lying, just straight up lying. And you can find articles directly contradict what they're saying. So I think it's good to be curious and criticize what they're saying and actually fact check.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much. This is Work Week, and we've been talking with Ashley Gjøvik, and this is Steve Zeltzer. And I think this story is continuing and ongoing. So thanks for joining us. I think it's been valuable to not only get the knowledge out about your struggle, but to protect all people, human beings, and the environment in Silicon Valley. Well, I want to thank you very much. This is Work Week, and we've been talking with Ashley Gjøvik, and this is Steve Zeltzer. And I think this story is continuing and ongoing. So thanks for joining us. I think it's been valuable to not only get the knowledge out about your struggle, but to protect all people, human beings, and the environment in Silicon Valley.
Thank you so much, Steve.